The Digital Science Speaker Series likes to shine a light on people that are shaking up the way that we do science and research in general. And today's guest is no exception. As head of partnerships at the Frontiers Planetary Prize, Gilbert De Gregorio is going to tell us all about what he's doing. Gilbert, thank you so much for joining us today. We have a bunch of stuff in common, which we are probably going to get to chat about.
Excited.
But first off, can you introduce yourself and your background?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you very much for allowing me to have this opportunity to speak with you. I'm very excited. So my name is Gilbert. I am a chemist by training. Did quite a lot of chemistry, so undergrad and PhD, also interface with chemical engineering. Very interested in everything to do with biofuel sustainability or back to ionic liquids. So yeah, I guess that was a small portion of my career. So working within science, and I'm a very big advocate for planetary health. But also I think during my time doing my PhD, I was also quite an advocate for ensuring wide dissemination of research. Everyone has access to the most important research. For them to build upon it, they can innovate, and then they can actually make their impact and contribute to the whole academic wealth of knowledge that we have. So from there, I worked in open access publishing, and that was a really great experience. It's with Frontiers, and there I was overseeing the sustainability portfolio, physical sciences and engineering, and also worked with some biological sciences titles. It was really a great time. And that led me to what I'm doing right now. So, and I assume you're probably going to talk to me about it. So now I oversee the partnerships strategy for the Frontiers Planet Prize, which is an initiative that we launched with the Frontiers Research Foundation. So that's a bit about me.
I am going to talk about the Frontiers Planet Prize, but I find it really interesting that we have really similar backgrounds, but I would say that your engagement with how research and scholarly communications works was maybe miles ahead of mine. When I joined digital science, we went to a thing called Pidapalooza, and I had to Google what a PID was, a PID, a persistent identifier, because I was that far removed from the mechanics and the infrastructure of research, let alone knowing how I can best contribute to it. Yeah. How did you find out so much about that? How did you get so engaged in that side of things?
Do you know, I think that's a very good question. And I think one thing that I absolutely adored doing research, and I really liked my time at Imperial College and learning from the greatest minds. But one thing I've realized is that there is a systemic issue with the sharing of knowledge, because whenever we published, I always went to the community. I thought, okay, we had the greatest readership, not knowing what open access was. And I thought, okay, that's great. You published for impact because that's what you needed to do. And that became somewhat frustrating. And it was actually thanks to my supervisor who made me really think about, if you want to make the greatest reach so that other people can actually work on what you're doing, think about other outlets where anyone can use it, they can download it, and you don't need a subscription, and then they can work and build upon it. So I think I learned about it during my PhD, but only realized how important it was once I started thinking, okay, how could I use my research background and all of the endemic issues and obstacles with research dissemination and all that knowledge, how could you share it very openly to make sure that everyone has a chance to make their impact? And I think that was kind of the inflection point. So I thought, okay, I'm actually wanting to do something a little bit more to make sure we can address this. And that's why I kind of fell into publishing, open access publishing.
That's amazing. I think that democratization of research information is exactly what we're aiming for, just to enable people to build on all of that knowledge, to create collaboration, to create innovation within research, and not just from the people that already have the privilege of being in it as well. I think that's super important. You mentioned your supervisor. It was Tom Welton. We're going to talk about him probably at length shortly, because he's a little hero of mine. But first, I want to talk a little bit more about what you're doing at Frontiers Research Foundation, particularly with the Frontiers Planet Prize. Can you tell us a little bit about it? What's the purpose of the prize, first of all?
Absolutely. So a bit of context. So the Frontiers Research Foundation was founded a couple of years back in Lausanne, and the Planet Prize is one of the initiatives that fall within the foundation. And the mission of the prize is very straightforward. It's about mobilizing the scientific community at large to accelerate scientific solutions that address our planetary health, and specifically to enable healthy lives on a healthy planet. So that's kind of like the high-level mission of what you want to do. But what does that actually mean? And it's essentially a competition. It's an international science competition that takes elements of the Olympics in the sense of getting the best research out of each country with a bit of a brazen statement. We want to make the sustainability, the Nobel Prize of Sustainability. So each country has a winning researcher. We call them the national champion. And you can think of them as the gold medalist on the podium. And we have a series of national champions. And then also from a round of voting from our jury, we have an international jury of 100 that's led by Professor Johan Rockström. So he is the pioneer of the planetary boundaries framework. We have 3 international champions. And these are the individuals who each win 1 million Swiss francs to invest in their research, to accelerate their research, to make sure that they can actually have a place at the most important engagement roundtables and policy with entrepreneurs, so we can actually make their impact in kind of restoring, let's say, planetary imbalances. So in a nutshell, that's what the prize is.
I mean, that's huge. And that acceleration, that injection of funding as well is amazing. I love the international aspect of it as well. You said Olympics. I'm feeling more Champions League. I would. As a Liverpool fan, I'll always go for that. We used to be good. So you're head of partnerships, and I think that's sort of fundamental to bringing all of these different people together. Can you tell us a little bit more about who you want in the room where it happens, you know, how we can bring them all together and how that catalyzes progress?
Absolutely. So there are kind of 2 streams in terms of our partnerships where we can actually make a big impact on that side. So within the team, we're relatively small. But the most important thing is, on the first aspect, to make sure that we mobilize the scientific actors. So these are the individuals where they can promote this prize within their networks so that the most promising researchers with their research submit and are nominated by their institution to participate in the prize. So that means our partners, we have about 450 institutions from 44 countries across the world. We do call them our partners. Their term is national nominating bodies. Then we have academies of each country. So these represent the institutions of each country, and they're the ones on the ground who work with these institutions in getting the research and putting them forward. So that's kind of one side, the scientific partners. But then we also have our engagement partners. So these could be Falling Walls being one of them, as we're here, and we use it as a very good platform to showcase the work of our champions. We also work with the Villars Institute, which is a new institute that promotes intergenerational collaboration to address biodiversity and climate change. With Future Earth and the Earth Commission, who are very similar mantra to us. And then finally, the Potsdam Institute of Climate to research impact, where Yaron is based. And all of these institutions and these partners are really important for us, as we use them as a way to make sure that we have a seat at the table where important decisions are made that define the health of our planet. So that's why partnerships for us is incredibly important, because it's a way of outsourcing the work. So we kind of make this happen organically, but as long as each partner has ownership and they know they can make an impact by putting the national champions at the right places, this is essentially how the prize works, and why partnerships are incredibly important for the prize.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think just bringing all those people together and the seat at the table as well, that advocacy is really important, raising and amplifying the voices of people that matter, including everybody. We will talk about inclusion as well, because, you know, especially with Tom Welton. But what I wanted to maybe touch on is you talked about how this is kind of the Nobel Prize of sustainability. The Nobel Prize can be criticized for certain things. What makes this different to something like that? Because it's just as prestigious, but I'd say maybe different in its impact and its inclusion. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Absolutely. I think there are 2 things about this prize that make it different to the Nobel Prize. The first thing is, Nobel Prize looks at the lifelong contribution of an individual within their field. And it's precisely that, it's within their field. Whereas this is not looking at lifetime contribution. Anyone can be nominated. An early career researcher, someone who's an emeritus professor, anyone can put themselves forward. It's all based on one academic paper. And the important thing about this paper, which is somewhat different from the Nobel Prize, although I'm not too clear about how transparent the evaluation process is with them, is that we have a very robust series of evaluation that takes the form of basically peer review. So an institution would select the best nominations from the university to put forward to their national academy. They aggregate all of these nominations and pick the best 3 to then share it with a jury of 100. At that point, the jury of 100 will then, out of all of the nominations they received from the academy, select one winner for each country, and then, in a second round of voting, the international champion. And it's a very transparent process, not in terms of you can't say exactly who goes through and who doesn't, but it's transparent in the sense that you know exactly who's evaluating it, and it's all done by active members of the community and those committed to planetary health. So I think that's what makes it fundamentally different.
I love that. So the Frontiers Planet Prize was launched in 2022, is that correct?
I have to go and get my numbers right. That is correct. Last year, Earth Day, April the 22nd, 2022. Wow,
Brilliant. That's a lot of twos.
Yeah, I just realized.
And a lot of factors of twos.
Yes.
And multiples. Wow, gosh. Yeah, it's a good number. I have a thing about numbers. Can you tell me about some of the impact that you have seen so far of the prize?
Oh, yes, the impact. I think there's very many ways you can kind of measure the impact. But one thing which I found absolutely fantastic is in the first year, we got 230 institutions from 24 countries involved. And that was a very proactive, letting people know about it and getting everyone very excited about this. But I think that on one hand, the impact has been so notable, specifically in the participation, the number of new institutions that joined. It was 233, now we're at 460, so practically doubled. We've doubled the number of countries. We now have, I believe, 45 countries on board. And this has been very organic. They've come to us to say we'd love to participate. So it's good to see that works.
Yeah.
And in terms of the second part of the impact, which for me is the most exciting part, is knowing that the international and the national champions are being recognized as thought leaders by the most important people within the community, policymakers, entrepreneurs, science engagement advocates. And they naturally go to them and say, we have a spot at this table where your background in, for example, nature-based solutions for deforestation, we need you here. And that, for me, is the greatest thing you can see, because it's just an amplification, it's a consequence of what we're doing, but it's not something that's within the control and something that we want to engineer. It happens naturally, and I think that, for me, is a really great thing to see.
I love that. So I have mentioned that we both have fairly similar backgrounds. We both worked in sustainability research, in chemistry. You are a green chemist by trade, aren't you?
Yes.
How much of that are you able to bring into this role? Do you really nerd out when you get an amazing kind of green chemistry solution?
So, I mean, as I am being part of the Frontiers Research Foundation, I'm here really to facilitate and coordinate as much as I can. And at no stage do I influence any part of the evaluation. So from that perspective, I geek out, but when I do, I kind of do it alone. And that's when I see all of the papers being published from the national champions, and I can download them and read them. For me, it's really enlightening to see exactly what's happening. But I think one thing which I've realized, I don't know if it's a generational change or maybe it's because I'm a chemist, is working, and you've seen this yourself, right? When you're a chemist, you're very much devoted to your domain. You're devoted to your discipline. You're making sure that you can push the boundaries of your knowledge by applying principles like thermodynamics, kinetics into a specific problem to get a solution. The Planet Prize isn't about that. It's about ensuring you get different stakeholders together to co-create the solution. And it's never one specific discipline. So I think my research background has helped me appreciate the nuances of the research ecosystem, but also allows me to sit back and actually look back and be quite impressed with hindsight.
Yeah.
Just how we've actually developed and how we've progressed very much in harnessing different ways of thinking to address specific systemic issues.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Definitely. I would probably say I was a materials chemist.
Yeah.
So I started as a regular chemist, analytical chemist, materials chemist. So I think I had the privilege, which is quite rare as you go from undergrad through to PhD to postdoc, of broadening my skills, of broadening the areas of research that I was including in my work and the people that I was working with as well. And I do think that's quite fundamental, particularly to sort of sustainable solutions. And it is a more inclusive, I think, way of thinking about things. So speaking of inclusion, you had the utter privilege of being supervised by a chemistry legend, Professor Tom Welton, former president of the Royal Society of Chemistry. And he's a huge advocate for, well, inclusion and representation, not just within chemistry and the chemical sciences, but in research more broadly. Do you feel that sense of influence in the type of work that you do and the ways that you do what you do through your partnership programs?
I'm going to be completely honest. Yes, and I had when I finished my PhD, I did have a think about what, apart from the actual science and the hard skills I learned, what did I learn from that experience? One thing I really appreciated working within his group was it was such an international group. And he made sure that there was a lot of cultural appreciation of how everyone conducted their research. And another thing made me realize is the privilege when you study in an institution from the global north, let's say, and you have other individuals who come as visiting students who are very bright and very promising, but don't have the same knowledge because they never had the opportunity to learn that. Then you realize there has to be something to drive equity here. And I think this is something I've always kind of kept in mind. And this is why, and I'm glad you mentioned our partners, we ensure that we need to have this diversity of thought. Whenever we have an issue that's, it's the global north creating these problems and climate change that's impacting the socioeconomic well-being of people in the global south, you have to address that. So by working with our partners, notably we have one of our organizations, the International Science Council, who make sure that they get a lot of interest in the global south, specifically in the African continent, to get loads of researchers involved to participate in the prize. For us, that's a really, really great way to ensure that at least within these pockets of the world, we do have participants who can potentially be national champions representing their country. So I think that Tom Welton has really helped ensuring that was the case. But if I may, and aside from the inclusion, one thing I really liked about Tom was he gives you the environment for you to really appreciate and own your passion for your subject. In such a way, he provides guidance wherever you need, but it's really up to you to take it and to push your research in the direction that you want to take it. And I think that was such a fantastic thing that happened with him. And one thing I'm incredibly grateful for.
Autonomy and ownership of the work that you're doing and all the lived experience that you bring into that as well to make that research better. Yeah, he's brilliant. He's absolutely great. So we've talked a little bit about inclusion in these prizes. We've talked about privilege as well within research. I suppose being part of a program of prize giving, of giving people this funding, of deeming somebody's work to be better than others, it can be quite challenging, I suppose, because you often see within research that somebody will win a prize quite early on in their career, and they may come from, a more financially privileged institution that has the kind of money where they can invest in their students, their postdocs, their researchers generally. They then get more exposure having won that prize, which then can snowball to winning other prizes. And it sort of ends up further feeding that research privilege. What's different about the Frontiers Planet Prize? What do you do to ensure that the outreach that you do is including as many amazing ideas from as many different backgrounds as possible?
That is a brilliant question, and it's and in all transparency, it is a challenge that we had to address right from the start, because there's a huge disparity of funding between different institutions, and it has to be addressed. So the way that the prize is dealing with this is kind of linked to what I mentioned about partnerships. The most we cannot engineer or influence the evaluation process, but what we can do is right at the start of the whole process is make sure that there is as equal opportunity as possible for everyone. And not only that, we have a really strong call for participation in areas where they potentially wouldn't feel they have the confidence to even put their work forward, and to tell them, no, do it. And I think linking back to kind of my previous point, each country can have a national champion.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to benchmark the quality of research between one country and another, because there are not only funding differences, but cultural differences. All of these has to be taken into account. And also the solutions they're trying to drive in one part of the world is different from another. So for particularly US and Zambia, for example. So in these cases, ensuring that everything is done on a country level, where the academy oversees and feeds it up to the jury, allows it to have benchmarking happen on a country level. And then the second thing we do is to make it absolutely clear how important it is to drive diversity by having the most diverse nominations put forward, and also to challenge any subconscious bias when you put forward any researchers, especially at lead scientists, because you're completely right. Majority of lead authors, they get to that position because they may have had the privilege of having more funding and more resource support in their early career. So this is the two areas that really drive it. But having said that, we know it's still a systemic issue. So as long as each organization, if they're able to make a difference, I think it's their responsibility, and they should take accountability to make sure it happens. If everyone does that, then it can be something that will eventually change. But admittedly, it's a huge challenge, and as it stands right now.
But I think your transparency in it being a challenge and really setting out the ways you're trying to mitigate that is really encouraging, because others can learn from that as well. And it is just one more way that we can try and make things more equitable and a little bit fairer, so that we get that representation of these amazing ideas. I think it's great. So what do you think is the greatest challenge that the research community is facing at the moment?
Oh, that's a very big question. The biggest challenge, I think you can slice that in very many different ways. But I would say one of the biggest challenges is how funding should be distributed. I think funding is one thing that I've realized. You can take some grants. I'm taking like the ERC grant, for example. Everything is split into disciplines. One problem with that is it allows it to continue funding Blue Sky's research, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think it's great to have. But we've realized, and what I've realized by working with the Frontiers Planetary Prize, how important it is to have a systems thinking approach to address issues. And that means thinking about the different stakeholders who are implicated in a problem, and then co-creating the solutions from these individuals who represent different disciplines. So for example, a physicist who, I'm taking an example of one of the international champions, a physicist who worked on understanding the policies to drive subsidies in agriculture, linking that with climate change and atmospheric physics, putting those two together, I think is something that's incredibly important. Like that, you're finding new kind of kernels of knowledge through these collaborations. And I don't think the funding framework at large is set up to allow this co-creation of ideas from people from different disciplines. So I think I wouldn't say I'm an expert per se, but from my knowledge and my understanding, we've got substantial funding. But I feel that we can channel it in a lot more of an efficient way to drive outcomes that can actually address planetary and socioeconomic issues, rather than do it to fuel more knowledge for something that ultimately will be published in a high impact journal, but won't actually be built upon later.
Yeah. I think funding is a real challenge. You've mentioned just one aspect of it. We, Digital Science are part of the Research and Research Institute. We did a randomization trial around, how we can allocate grant funding differently. The British Academy have recently done something on their small grant scheme, I believe. And it's really interesting to see so many projects not just being funded, but really be so impactful. Whereas if we had stuck with old ways of doing things, they just would have been overlooked right at that first hurdle. So I do think it's one of the big things that we need to address, quite badly. I guess I'm going to then come to our final question, which is, we've talked about challenges. You come with very practical solutions as to how we can overcome them. You catalyze a bunch of these solutions through the prize. What is the one thing that you would like to see that will ensure a positive and productive future of research?
I'm going to have to give that a quick thought. I think I think there are a number of different things for me which are very important. Um, some of them are more kind of operational, and others are more, I would say, cultural in how we conduct research. So the first thing, I think it goes without saying that research should be made open for all, right? I think it's clear. You've seen with COVID when you start opening up removing paywalls, how quickly we managed to come up with vaccines. I mean, record time. I think this should be replicated directly for our climate emergency. That, for one, is extremely important. So that's good. The second thing is ensure that transformational science is also embedded on top of that. That means you have a lot of research, but which ones? How can you drive that in such a way where you can build and then deliver on these social and planetary changes? So those two, for me, are very important. And the third thing, what I would really like to see is a complete change in the way that we try to drive a solution for a specific problem without coming up and linked to the systems thinking approach I mentioned before. Transdisciplinarity is extremely important, and making sure that before you start coming up with a solution that you think will solve the problem, try to define that problem first with all the different stakeholders who are being impacted and come up with that solution together, because that will probably even be a cheaper way of doing it. But you know that you'll be addressing something which will more likely drive change on a policy front, and even entrepreneurs can build into it because you've done your due diligence. So I think this, for me, would be a really great way, something that I'd really like to see within research moving forward. But I think there's still a lot of ground that needs to be covered first to set the foundation for that and set a new set of metrics, a new evaluation system. But I do find it's the best way for us to really harness all the resources that we have to address planetary challenges.
There's a real responsibility of using those resources in the most efficient, most productive way. And I don't think that research necessarily supports that with the culture that we work within at the moment. So I think it's such a reminder of the fact that we can and should be driving for changes that do make research way, way better. Gilbert, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure to geek out with you. You don't have to nerd out about chemistry on your own anymore. Give me a call. Thank you so much.